It's really great to have you here, and I really look forward to the conversation. I read Finn's book with a lot of interest, and I was going to say I read it in two parts. I initially read it having bought it for my partner, who was the first person to draw my attention to the fact that the so-called gender wars in the UK have a longer intellectual history than I was perhaps giving them credit for. So when another sociologist and activist, Ruth Pierce, I think rather fortuitously dubbed TERF wars, first became a thing, I remember looking at the arguments and then just basically saying, this makes no sense. There is no foundation for this argument at all. And then my partner actually drew my attention to, basically started saying, having been raised in sort of queer environments, saying something along the lines of, well, there is actually an intellectual genealogy to this. And then when Finn's book came out, I was really interested, and I bought it as a gift to my partner, and then obviously read quite a big portion of it prior to giving it to him, which I think is just basic courtesy, and then have read the rest of it prior to this discussion. So I think it's a great book. I really encourage everyone to buy it, and as Anthony said, to make use of the discount that Bloomsbury's offering. So Finn, really great for you to taking the time to talk to us today.
Thank you.
So one of the first things I wanted to say about the book, and kind of on the track of the introduction, is that I think it's a marvelous work of intellectual history. And one of the things that I kept thinking about it as I was reading the book is precisely the degree to which, obviously in feminism, in some ways, we are always moving, not exactly in circles, but perhaps in spirals. We're always revisiting in some ways the old discussions. And in that sense, it was really interesting for me to have an opportunity to read something that I think is such an astute analysis of the history and evolution of the debates around the sex-gender dichotomy, as well as the history of self-identification in terms of gender in the UK. As Anthony also mentioned, as always, with the philosopher, we are perhaps even more timely than we thought we would be. I promise we didn't plan it as such, but it was only last week on the Trans Day of Visibility, on top of all things, that the UK government decided to make a U-turn on banning conversion therapy, but not for trans people. So as it were, we are at the space of something that I think, Finn, you also referred to in the conclusions of your book as both kind of looking back or looking behind, but also looking ahead. So given where we are in terms of history, one of the things I was going to ask you as an opening thing, and I'm really sorry because this is the boring thing to ask anyone about their book, is if you wouldn't mind just summarizing the kind of history of these debates to a degree to which you cover it in the book, especially when it comes to the UK and the US, because I'm assuming some of our audience is kind of familiar with this background, although I guess, like myself, everyone can always use a refresher because it is a long and the complex history. And then perhaps also say a bit about what perspective were you accessing this debate from, and what made you think that perhaps there's really a need to in some ways prevent that part of the history of the feminist and queer movements from just being forgotten or being erased within this gender war thing?
Yeah, I mean, yes, that is a big question. And there's a practical sort of legal and policy history. And then there's the lineage sort of going back to sex and gender conservative authorities and institutions. So say back to the Vatican, and then we've got right-wing, very long tradition of right-wing sex and gender conservatism promoting ideas of tradition, which are obviously around very strict gender roles and ideas about the nuclear family. And then there's a feminist history, as you mentioned as well. And I suppose why I wanted to write the book was because I come from a political background of organising in the women's liberation movement, and firstly in the women's peace movement. I have worked with and in and around radical feminists and radical feminist organisations. I learned a lot from radical feminists and revolutionary feminists who themselves had been active in, you know, legacy building protest and legal campaigning in the 1970s and 80s. So I had that background. And then I'd also been involved in LGBT organising and queer community building for a long time as well. And I suppose I was saddened to see a politics that I identified with and resonated with, that being radical feminism, being used in name to beat another minoritized group, you know, transgender and queer people. There's also a lot of misunderstandings about what radical feminism is generally, and I saw that on this question that was exactly the same. Perhaps there were even more myths and misunderstandings about what radical feminism is and is not. And our media, as it always does, like, is framing this issue as a binary, like you've said. You know, there's only, you have to pick a side and then stick to it. It also loves, the media has always loved a catfight within feminism. It wants to set generation against generation in feminism. And that's what it's focusing on. And I think as well that demeans the seriousness and validity of feminism as a movement and the women's liberation movement as a social justice movement with a complex history and methods and activism. And it also demeans the huge human rights issues and debates about trans rights and trans rights as a social justice movement, because it's being shuffled off as if it's a feminist issue, or it's feminists that are the problem. And because feminists are stigmatized and feminism is stigmatized, that also, it demeans everyone involved really, and it sort of silos off that question. But I think here in the UK, we're often being scrutinized as having particular problems here with the so-called gender wars. Back in 2015, a Women and Equalities Select Committee organised to look at updating the GRA, the Gender Recognition Act 2004. Other European countries were updating theirs. And so there was a mixed group of a Women and Equalities Select Committee. It's all different political parties are involved, to look at reform of the Gender Recognition Act. They then presented their report, their first report, I think it was the next year under Nicky Morgan. They said that they did propose liberalisation, they did propose reform. They said it should be easier, it should be online, it should be cheaper to get what's called a GRC, or a gender recognition certificate, which is a legal process of trans recognition for trans men and trans women in the UK. And then, of course, after that, the year after that, 2017, Theresa May was actually at a Pink News Awards, so an LGBT awards ceremony dinner, and she made a speech saying that being trans is not a mental illness, and that the Conservative Party were going to move forwards and liberalise the Gender Recognition Act. And the Tories at that time seemed to be sort of peddling it as more fuel for the Tories to be seen as new, as not the nasty party, as progressive. They were very proud of the role they'd played in equal marriage. So you can look at that in different ways. You know, either they were just very naive and they thought that no one would pay any attention and it would be something nice and fluffy that they could have as a legacy and say, oh, look at this good thing we did for this little minority group. We did that, aren't we nice? And they didn't expect anything to happen. Or they just didn't care, because then, of course, they went and put it out to public consultation in 2018 with the Westminster public consultation on reform of the Gender Recognition Act. And that's quite an interesting move to start with, because if something is a human rights law, it's a matter of human rights law. Why put that out to public consultation? I think if we put many things out to public consultation now about anti-racism, inclusion, refugee rights, you would get quite a lot of hostile responses saying that things as they are have already gone too far and we shouldn't have any more. But if something is a human right, it's a human right. Tough if some people don't like it. So it could be conceived of as quite an unethical stance in the first place from the very beginning to do that as a public consultation, but they did. And I think it had about 100,000 responses. So it really mobilized a lot of response for and against liberalization, but there was also a fundamental misreading around so-called self-ID, which in that public consultation, it asked about other ways that countries have done this through legal process, like a statutory declaration, like you would have for a change of name deed. And so that was suggested, a statutory declaration. This was then received as self-ID. Lots of groups started mobilizing, asking people to respond to this consultation because we were going to have a terrible situation where the category of woman was going to be erased. Anyone could be a woman. A man who wanted to sexually assault women and children would be able to maybe go online, change all his documentation, change his legal sex marker, go into a space, an intimate space with women and children, say that he had his paperwork so he could be there, then sexually abuse, assault women and children, and then go back and change his markers back again. Or that either way, even if that didn't happen, the idea of self-ID would make women even more unsafe than they are already. And of course, the sad reality is that men who want to rape and abuse women and children are still most likely to do that in their families, in their own homes, in the homes of friends and relatives. They do not need to go through a process and live and identify as a trans woman in order to rape and abuse. Sadly, women are not safe as it is. But there was a lot of concerns around this one section of the consultation, and many anti-trans inclusion groups and groups against liberalising the GRA all started around that time, 2017, 2018. And ever since then, this debate has carried on here in the UK vociferously.
To say the least. Thank you for that. I think that's a really exhaustive, but also a very succinct summary. And I hope that for those of our among our audience who may have not been entirely following the UK debates, although I think in many ways the UK is kind of together with the US at the forefront of these debates, which isn't necessarily a good thing, or it doesn't say anything good about us. I think that this would hopefully have given them a sufficient background in terms of how we came to where we are today. You also, I think, pointed out something that is very relevant to the current discussion, and that's the degree of political mobilization of the question of gender identity and trans rights. Not in the traditional sense in which we expect groups such as LGBT and feminist groups to actually have it as an issue or to use it as an issue in order to further the agenda of gender equality and perhaps gender abolition as well, which we'll get to later. But actually, the process by which other political actors who at least would have not conventionally who would not have been conventionally associated with this kind of movement or rights started in some ways monopolizing it. And as you noted, first of all, the Conservative Party with its sort of, I guess, sort of gay-friendly agenda. I think we may generously call it that. I think that's an interesting question because there is clearly, there are many European analogies where conservative parties were in many ways trying to be more, or well, pretending to be more LGBT friendly, often, as you noted, through the extension of the concept of marriage so as to include sort of same-sex relationships. But again, with the emphasis on the sanctity or primacy of marriage as an essentially traditional form of human relationship, and the dyadic one at that. And I think the other thing is then moving on, as you noted, in the past couple or now already sort of 5-6 years to the TERF, I guess, ground, where it's a much more not only polarized debate, but a polarizing debate where all of a sudden everyone seems to have a position on trans rights. And, you know, one of the things that I think are very obvious about this when you kind of take a step outside is that a lot of people who are not directly in any way, or at least not in the narrow sense of the term, impacted by trans rights or the Gender Recognition Act seem to have an opinion and a position on it. So what do you think is the source of this polarization? So where does it come from? What is it driven by?
Yeah, I mean, it has got so fierce. There is often just misinformation around as well. We're also dealing with a backlash against, you know, a human rights movement that has only recently, you know, I think it was 2014 that Time magazine did its trans tipping point cover, and, you know, Caitlyn Jenner was then on the cover of Vanity Fair the year after. So a lot of people were becoming aware of the social justice movement for trans rights, a human rights movement that had been going on for decades for trans rights, but for the first time, it came to prominence. It came out onto the public stage and people became aware of it. And with any social movement, social justice movement, when it has that sort of burgeoning point where it comes out onto the public stage, you will always get a backlash, because for many people, they'll become aware of that movement. But when they become aware of it, they think it's already gone too far, because they're thinking, why is this now on my television and on my front covers of my magazines and on my radio? I'd rather it stayed in whatever shadowy place it was in before. So they, unfortunately, I think a lot of people in general, when they find out about a new social justice movement, it's already gone too far, because they think they should never have found out about it in the first place. So you always get a backlash against social justice movements anyway. So we also have that going on as well around trans rights. And then there is a lot of misinformation. So, for example, last year, there was the coverage in the press about how Brighton, I think it was Brighton and Sussex, how health trusts there, were not going to refer to anyone as a mother or as a pregnant woman or as talk about breastfeeding for new mothers. They were only going to be allowed to talk about chest feeders and birthing parents. And then, of course, the truth came out that the trust had worked with a group to come up with some guidance for midwives and health professionals who were working with trans parents. So it was specific guidance for if you were working with trans parents, here's some terms and definitions that people might use, here's words that people might like to use for themselves. So that was the actual truth of the matter. However, already by that point, I think most broadsheets and tabloids in the UK had covered it as, you know, it's all gone too far now. You can't say breastfeeding and pregnant woman in Brighton. So some things did correct it, but of course nobody remembers the correction. So there is a public idea which the media does not do enough to correct. There is a public feeling that services are being taken away, words are being taken away, spaces are being taken away, when it is just not happening. And in fact, what is happening is an ongoing situation where minority groups who may become parents or are going through healthcare have had bad treatment, have not had words for themselves, have not even been given terms to describe themselves, or have had to use horrible pathologizing, stigmatizing terms put upon them. It is those minority groups that have been wrestling with having no spaces, no terms, no language, no recognition. It's not the majority group that still has spaces, recognition, words, terms. And in fact, the idea of having those changed or taken away is so shocking and horrific, because the minority group has never had to deal with that, has never had to deal with going to a service and people calling you a freak, or not even knowing what to call you, or telling you to get out of a place that you are actually meant to be in. You know, many people have not had to deal with that. And there is an assumption that now all of these terrible things are happening and you can't be called a mother and you can't talk about breastfeeding. And of course, what trans rights groups themselves are saying is, we're not actually asking for that. We're just saying that people are aware. And if you have someone who doesn't want to use those terms, you know how to include them, you know words to use, you know that these people exist. You know, it's like with languages, you can go to your GP now and ask for a leaflet about a health procedure or something in a different language. It doesn't mean if you go in there, here where I am at the moment in the UK, and you happen to be a first language English speaker and you go in asking for a leaflet in English and they go, oh, sorry, we've only got it in Irish Gaelic, you'll just have to have that one. Of course they wouldn't. That's not how it works. It's an additive model. It's more services, more spaces, more awareness. That can only be a good thing. But I think if you do just kind of read the headlines and you do think that there will be no terms, no spaces anymore, no antenatal groups, no new mums groups, then yeah, that does sound quite shocking. So I think some of the shock and alarm, this idea of a movement gone too far for a tiny minority group and then taking over everything, it comes from misinformation. But for the people that think that it's true, it is motivating and people are exercised about it.
That's all right. I think we're reconnected. Hello. I don't know whether it was your connection or mine.
I don't know.
You froze for a minute for me, and the last thing I heard was for the people who think it's true.
Yeah. So the people who think it's true, they perhaps understandably are quite exercised about it. So if you really did think that all these things were happening, that does sound quite alarming. It does sound like whole institutions being changed for less than 1% of the population. Of course, that's not actually what is happening, but people believe that it is.
I think there's definitely something to be said about, and I think this is something really interesting to explore in the sense of the tension between the individual and the collective as well, right? I think there's definitely, and it's probably the majority of the reason comes from what you've described, which is the sense, which is clearly a created sense that sort of public goods are limited, and that thus if they need to be distributed across small populations, that means that each, whatever that means, group gets less of it. But I think there's definitely something to be said about you know, precisely where the introduction of your book comes in, and that's just the fact that people have always been afraid of not only things and concepts, but also people who cross boundaries. And in that sense, I think, I mean, it's always a bit of a sort of a narrow psychoanalytical interpretation, but I think there's definitely something to be said about anxiety over status and identity, and the more normative, or the closer to the norm that people are, it does seem like the more anxiety it provokes in them to think about the fact that not only that there may be people who do not fit these norms, but that they also may no longer be closeted, and in fact may, you know, sort of shock horror, even use the same bathrooms as they will. So in that sense, it's probably something, I guess, to be said about that kind of anxiety. So I'm just wondering if, you know, where does that sort of anxiety come from and how it maps onto the collective rights issue?
Absolutely. I mean, we can't overlook the politics of scarcity, you know, that we're living with here in the UK, which the Tories are actively promoting and whipping up to justify their own ideological cutbacks to welfare, to community, to the welfare state. So we know that that is going on. And yes, within that, we have a zero-sum approach to essential services and public goods. So who are this new group coming in, getting a piece of the pie? Yes. And who are they taking it away from? Yes, that has always, you know, that affects this and all social justice movements. So we're operating within that framework as well. And then I think at times like that as well, when people are more precarious, when people are in financial insecurity, housing insecurity, you know, obviously Brexit has influenced on this as well, and I think is linked. I think all of this is linked. I think at precarious times and insecure times, people are more easily seduced by ideas of fixity, by ideologies that sort of hark back to a rose-tinted idea of the nuclear family, the ideal family, a time when, okay, you maybe didn't have much and you had to work hard, but at least a man was a man, a woman was a woman. You had mums and dads and children being raised at home. Of course, this whole idea, as we know, was always a fiction. You know, the family has always been a troubled and fractious sort of site of human relationships and abuse, of course, and abuses of power. And I think people know that, but still it doesn't make the idea of it any less seductive. The idea of stability, of a home, of a family, where roles are discrete and understood. And I think, again, the Tories have promoted that and used all that ideology to whip up, you know, the culture wars that we're in now. I think as well that society is a lot more sex and gender conservative than we sometimes like to think. And here in the UK, on paper, it may be more radical, but I think in the hearts and minds and the playgrounds and the school gates and the supermarkets and the clothes shops and the public toilets, it's perhaps still a lot more, conservative than people perhaps think. So that's going on as well. And also, I think some of the anger as well comes from the fact that the media tells us we're having this gender revolution, that there's a lot of, you know, young queer people that don't want to be boxed in, they don't want to use labels. There's 57 different terms on Facebook, you know, for gender. Professors doing research like E.J. Reynolds in British schools find over 23 different terms in use for gender identity alone. You know, young people think they're a vanguard, they're at the forefront of something good. And I think some of this as well that's coming from women mobilizing is because we're being told, you know, the public is being told we're having this gender revolution, but there is still very little evidence of an actual revolution in power between women and men. COVID has highlighted that, because existing inequalities have been, you know, exacerbated even more. Women more likely, you know, to have taken time off, to have reduced hours, to have lost their jobs, to be subject to pregnancy discrimination, maternity discrimination, to be taking on more childcare, more work in the home. So I think there's anger about that as well. I think some people feel, well, hang on, we haven't actually sorted out gender equality. So how are we suddenly having this gender revolution when there's no concrete change really in power between these groups that we call women and men? And I think some of it is coming from that too. And then of course there's just a resurgence across Europe, across North America, of pro-natalist sex and gender conservatism and a call to a return to traditional values. I mean, 2 weeks before you know, Russian bombs started falling in Ukraine, Oliver Dowden, the chairman of the Tory party, went over to the US to speak to the Heritage Foundation, anti-abortion, anti-choice, anti-divorce, you know, anti-LGBT organization. And he made a speech while he was there saying that it was something along the lines of how it was no surprise that strong countries like Russia and China are threatening the West because the West is too busy worrying about pronouns, pulling down our statues, disrespecting our own tradition and history. And so it's no wonder strong countries will kind of come for us. Echoing very similar things that Putin has said himself about the dangers of the sort of decadent West. So there's a backlash, you know, there's a backlash coming from fundamentalist religious organizations, right-wing states, right-wing parties, and nationalist parties.
It's a particularly precarious time to get into the debate between, in particular, and on such a sort of precarious ground, I guess, as the distinction between, say, radical feminism and trans-exclusionary radical feminism, which kind of brings me back to the very argument of the book. In some ways, you've entered the debate from the perspective of saying, look, yet another of the dichotomies that people like to think is is a dichotomy, so is binary, so either you're with us or you're against us, is perhaps not that clear cut. So could you say a bit more about that, and also kind of how you approached it, what the reactions so far have been, and I think most importantly, what do you see as a value of transcending dichotomies in that way, especially when it comes to discussions that are, on the one hand, I guess, academic, so to speak, but then on the other hand, clearly not only academic insofar as they concern very much actual people's lives and their safety and their right to self-identify at the end of the day.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously, this word TERF that is now used a lot, and I'm sure everyone will have heard it, trans exclusionary radical feminists. What people are perhaps less likely to know is that that acronym first emerged around 2008, I think it was, on a radical feminist message board online, where radical feminists were discussing things like Michigan Women's Music Festival, which itself is a sort of important point in these debates around trans inclusion and feminist approaches to trans inclusion as well. Huge, massive women's music festival on privately owned woodland near Grand Rapids in Michigan in the USA. And on a discussion board about that, people used that acronym just so they didn't have to keep spelling it out each time. Some things from that are really important that we should take from that. So one is that there was no homogenous radical feminist line on trans inclusion or exclusion. There were radical feminists in that group who were speaking from their organizations and groups in their own towns and cities. There were radical feminists working with and alongside other radical feminist activist organizers who happened to be trans women. And then you had radical feminists who, for their own political reasons, were choosing not to work with trans women and did not want to for their own political reasons. And there is, yes, there are certainly arguments from radical feminist writers about trans exclusion, but maybe more so from lesbian feminism, but that's another distinction. So but those facts, the fact that there wasn't one line, that there were radical feminists who were trans inclusive, those seem to have been forgotten. And now radical feminism has become synonymous with transphobia, with anti-trans bigotry, with trans exclusion, when it is not at all. That also erases the trans women who were part of organizing in the US, the UK, all around the world in second wave feminism, in women's liberation. There was trans women who were organizers, there were trans women who were movement builders and creators living in lesbian feminist communes. Trans women were there, they were part of building that we now see as a legacy of women's liberation. So yeah, these things have become synonymous now, which I think is unfortunate, because not all radical feminists are trans inclusive or trans exclusive or anti-trans bigots. But I'm also not naive about how language changes and evolves, and I am aware that in social media TERF has become a term used particularly maybe by younger generations to just mean anyone who is vociferously anti-trans. It's used for men, so you get Donald Trump is TERFy, you get J.K. Rowling is TERFy, Tory peers, ministers who are men are TERFs. It is used now to just mean virulently kind of transphobic, but which I think is a shame, because it minimizes and decreases. Radical feminism becomes meaningless in that, in the way that term is now used. And I have had discussions with conservative activists around other elements of radical feminist argument and theory. So of course it's interesting that people will only pick some points that you can find from some radical feminist texts about gender. They don't, for example, promote political lesbianism as a way to undermine patriarchy. They don't promote that everybody should not have a husband or male partner, that in order to destabilize patriarchy, people should build women's communities, not necessarily have romantic or sexual relationships with women. That's not what political lesbianism was about. It was about building women's communities. I don't see a lot of these people also agitating that the beauty industry is a form of violence against women, that compulsory heterosexuality is an oppression of women, that all women should eschew femininity on political grounds, that the nuclear family should be ended because it's a site of the recreation of power relationships. So people are they're only using the name or names of, feminism really to when they want to push an anti-trans argument. And I also think that radical feminists are not the heads of health trusts. They're not the heads of big health insurance firms. They're not the prime minister. They weren't the president of the USA. The people that are actually in power, who are making decisions which impact on trans people's lives, rights, family life, rights to have children, to bring up children, to marry or not marry, rights to pensions, rights not to be, subjected to cruel and inhumane treatment because of who they are. The people at the top of institutions making those decisions are not radical feminists. And so I think there's two things going on. We're rendering radical feminism a complex political history. We're rendering it meaningless. We are also siloing off this issue of trans rights as if it's a women's issue. It's a feminist question. It's some little internal debate within feminism. But actually, let's go to those big institutions. Let's go to the health trusts. Let's go to the presidents and the prime ministers. They're the people that are taking away and gatekeeping and policing rights, not radical feminists.
I think that's a great point. I think it really points out to how not only that's why I kind of wanted to emphasize the distinction between the debate as a polarized and a polarizing one, because I think where we actually see a lot of the political dynamics and clustering around these issues is precisely from trying to make it into a polarizing one, which is exactly what you're describing as this kind of pick and mix strategy of referring or not even referring, sort of in some ways, in a perverse way, I guess, citing the history of some of these debates within the feminist movement, but as you point out, also taking them very, very far outside of the context in which they were initially carried out, but then also in some ways, as you point out, relegating them to an almost fringe issue. So it's, in a manner of speaking, I guess it's a redrawing of boundaries of political debate, and that brings me kind of to the last point, which is in some ways. And I've seen occasionally that come up in the chat. I don't want to indulge it, but it's precisely the role of making certain sides, so to speak, legitimate sides in a debate. So saying that, yes, well, we should actually really be able to have a debate about, what is gender and what is sex and what is a man and what is a woman. So in that sense, do you think that there's anything useful to kind of, I don't know, perhaps draw on from these debates? Or where do you see the future of these debates going, in the sense of, can we actually move beyond the polarizing tone of these debates? Is there a way to actually rebuild a discussion, or is there even a need to rebuild discussion around gender in a way that's more, I don't really want to say civilized, because that's obviously a loaded term, but you know what I mean, in the sense of in a way that's constructive, or what do you see as the kind of future direction that we could perhaps think about?
Yeah, it's difficult, because of course we should have these debates, and in fact it's a radical feminist idea. Gender abolition and a post-gender society is a radical feminist idea, and famous Western radical feminists that I'm familiar with, have written about that. So absolutely, we should be able to talk about that. But then, I see some of the discourse which seems to be about rolling back existing rights for trans people, and then also not not making progress on things like the Gender Recognition Act. So actively rolling back rights and then not moving forward with any more. So that's quite extreme. I find that quite extreme, the idea that we should take away quite basic human rights that people fought for such a long time to get what really is the bare minimum. So, I do see arguments online, people saying we should repeal the whole Gender Recognition Act because being trans is a delusion. So we shouldn't have laws that cater to people's delusions. So let's take away the Gender Recognition Act because it's just pandering to that. People will be covered by anti-harassment kind of legislation anyway. Nobody should be allowed to get any kind of trans-affirming healthcare or interventions, surgeries or hormone treatments until they're 25 because their adult brains haven't formed until then. And then they should only be able to access treatment privately. They shouldn't get any of it on healthcare or insurance. So when you see people out there arguing things like that, you think, well, why is any trans rights organization really gonna want to have, a polite or, in quotes, civilized debate with people who are saying, well, I want to take away your rights, and I think that your identity and role is a delusion. Now, I think there's a debate to be had about how gender is a delusion in itself. And I also think, well, why don't we go up to the majority group? So why don't people who are critical of gender go out to stag and hen do's, go out in Newcastle or Bristol or Leeds on a Friday or Saturday night and go up to presumably non-trans women who are dressed in a feminine, sexualized way, and go up to presumably non-trans men who are dressed in a heterosexualized, masculinized way, and take it up with them about why they're reinforcing and perpetuating gender stereotypes. Because I think gender criticism, if it means anything, gender criticism should start at home. People should critique their own gender, perhaps, and their own gender identity. Because everyone is operating within this system. So why is it that only less than 1% of the population in trans people, only their journey through and intersection with and presentation of gender and gender roles and gender identity is some kind of weird freakish problem, and not everybody else's? Not the majority group who are also doing gender and presenting gender. And as I say as well, some of it is a lot of misinformation. I suppose if you did think that you were going to go to the doctors and they were going to refer to you as a chest feeder, they were going to deny the fact that you're a woman, they weren't going to use the terms that you had always used for yourself. Yeah, I can understand why people would think that was shocking, but that is not what is being promoted. So there is just such a lot of misinformation flying around there. I think, your area of work, is looking at these very things, the culture wars. I am a bit worried that they may have to get very bad before they get better. I mean, we've seen the Tories, just recently do this U-turn. I mean, it's not even so much that they're doing a U-turn on this bit of policy, because lesbian and gay and bisexual people are going to be wrapped up in any kind of conversion therapy for trans people anyway, because any sort of non-sex and gender normative presentation could therefore come under the trans bit. So it can still be conversion therapy of lesbian and gay and bisexual people too. So that's going on anyway. But for me, it's more the message. The government is sending the message. It is open season. It is fair game on trans people. And I think that's horrific, actually, and shocking, and how the radicalization of this whole arena of discourse, even over the past 2 years, I have found shocking. And if I was to write the book again, I would be a lot less hesitant about some individuals and organizations who, in the book, I said, it seems like they might be veering towards this, or it seems like they're moving towards that argument, who have now flat out come out and said, remove the GRA, trans is an illness. And it's got a lot more extreme. So I worry that the Tories are happy to have this distraction from their own evil agenda. And I worry they'll be only too happy to whip it up. And let's not forget, that in the US, a lot of this using the trans rights, trans people as a wedge issue was openly announced by right-wing evangelical groups in the US, you know, a value voters conference with a speaker called Meg Kilgannon, who said, this has all gone too far, the LGBT movement has gone too far, we can use the T and separate that off to bring the whole movement down because trans people are less palatable to the public, and we'll get this whole movement out of the way, which they refer to as a third wave of attack against the nuclear family. And they've succeeded in getting that to be the discourse. So I worry, yeah, I think we're at a bit of a fork in the road, you know?
That's a very good point, if not a very optimistic one, and a time for us to launch into the, I just realized that we did receive quite a few questions since. So I doubt that we'll have time to go through all of them. So apologies in advance to everyone who has asked a question, but it's been an incredibly interesting discussion. I really wanted to let Finn speak, so because I think they have so much interesting to say on the topic of the background as well as the current evolution of these discussions, which I think sometimes does not get really well understood in the UK and beyond. So I will start with Nicole Westmoreland's question, who asks, and I think this really, I mean, it kind of tags on to what you have just said, which is the distinction between, you know, in part, what gets framed as a problem or what gets framed as an issue. And that's, why do you think we hear so much more about trans women than trans men in this debate? And then I may as well actually append another question to this, although it's not the same, but this is from an anonymous attendee who's asking, who says, your book focuses on queer and female masculinities. What do you think the specific focus on masculinities brings to the gender wars? So I think they are related in the sense of the emphasis on masculinities, trans or not trans. So don't mind answering those two in whatever order.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's, you know, I think there's a sexism that goes on there around debates about trans men and trans men's identities and trans masculine identity. I think it's, I mean, that was partly why I platformed the voices of trans masculine and people and trans men, because I think when they are mentioned, trans men are constructed, you know, as victims. So we get these reassertions of sort of border wars from the 1990s that took place in lesbian communities around this idea of butch flight, and that there's now this construct. J.K. Rowling has written about it on her famous blog, of course, Some Thoughts on Sex and Gender. It's this construct of trans men as victims, as being actually young lesbians who, or maybe not, but could be young lesbians or young women who are in a flight from the feminine. They dislike sexual harassment, the male gaze, actual experiences of sexual harassment or assault, and so they flee from femaleness and they flee from femininity. This is often given as a reason as well for why there are higher numbers of young sexist female people going through gender identity clinics. So it's a real sort of victim narrative. And then the idea comes that they need to be rescued. You know, they need to be rescued from being trans, otherwise they'll be trans. So the suggestion being that they aren't actually trans. So that was partly why I wanted to platform those voices from people who are, of course, saying they're not victims. And also that's just such a bizarre idea, because all women and people who've been, you know, born into this world as a female person know and have experienced sexual harassment and the threat of sexual violence and the male gaze. But not all women deal with that by wanting to become men or to masculinize their bodies or to identify as men. So it's yet another situation where lots of things can be going on at once. Is sexual objectification of girls and young women a bad thing, and does it happen? Yes. Are there endemic levels of male sexualized violence against women and children? Yes. And all of these things are important issues. does that mean that there is no such thing as a trans man because everyone's just in a flight from the feminine? But then surely we would expect the majority of women to be in a flight from the feminine and want to be trans men if that was a response to sexism. But I think, you know, why we don't see so much about trans men, I mean, I think that's partly to do with this narrative of them being, which comes from a place of sexism as well. You know, those people having had histories of being sexed as female people, I think they aren't seen as a threat in the same way. They aren't seen as powerful or as change makers in any way. They are constructed as victims that just need rescuing. So there's less narrative around that because that's coming from a place of rescue rather than discussion about threat. Whereas trans women, of course, are represented as an innate threat.
And possibly in addition, I mean, this is just to, and I know that this answer has been put forward already, but, you know, in some ways, it's also to disrupt the patriarchal hierarchy of genders on the obvious assumption of gender binarism, by which, you know, clearly everyone should want to be a man, but, you know, no one should want to be a woman. So in that sense, I think there's possibly something to be said about that, in the sense in which, you know, sort of trans men are almost treated as, you know, within, again, the hierarchy of you know, beings or the spectrum of gender, that, you know, trans men are somehow still in some ways affirming from this perspective the hierarchy of gendered expression, and trans women are in that way really sort of disrupting it seriously.
Absolutely, no, of course, and because of those hierarchies of gender, there's absolutely less tolerance for people who have had the luck of birth of being born into the dominant group, getting read as or dressing as or presenting as or seeming to want to present themselves as being from the inferior group. There's a lot less tolerance for that, and of course we see that in, you know, from parenting onwards, from, you know, children's baby grows upwards, and that's what I was saying about how rigidly sex and gender conservative society still actually is. I could go out to Asda now and get baby grows that say, you know, supermodel in training for a girl, and, you know, future man of steel for a boy. I mean, for a baby. And that's another thing, you know, then the public likes to accuse trans or queer people of putting their identities in people's faces, putting their genders in people's faces. And you think, well, no, again, the very opposite is the case. You are putting heterosexualized, normative, presumably normative, you know, sex and genders in people's faces. You are training babies into these roles from dot. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And in your book, you also talk at length about precisely the way in which female masculinities and butch lesbianism in particular are also being singled out in the sense of being non-conforming, but also taking the brunt of this hatred, again, in the sense of not fitting within the prescribed idea of what gender, even if fluid, should look like, or what gender expression, even if fluid, should look like. Anthony said we can run until 8:05, so we have 3 minutes left. And we have quite a few questions, some of which I think are perhaps better answered by your book, or in your book, and by engagement with any of the history of writing on this matter. One thing, I think I'm going to take the question from Mary Stevens, who's, I mean, there's a preface to the question, but I think they're asking what the responsibilities for events organizers in terms of giving platforms to the diverse voices should be. And I'm using this because you've also picked up on the idea of, you know, a book is also a platform. So I guess it's the question also of, you know, how should we engage with opinions specifically in the gender wars, but also in the culture wars that Mark Carrigan refers to in his question, which is where he picks up on your expression, which is the military history of the culture wars, which I really like as well. So in the sense of, you know, what are our responsibilities to different sides in this culture war from your perspective?
Yeah, it's very difficult. I mean, I don't like the terminology either. I don't like militaristic language. I'm not a pro-militarist person. But it's a shorthand for the sort of situation that we see unfolding in front of us. Yes, so where's it, was that the question? Like, where is it going? Or so in terms of organizing, how far should we go then with letting both sides speak?
I guess. Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, it's in the sense of, if we are admitting, or if we're basically going along with the framing of this as a war, then we are in some ways already going along with the framing of there being two sides. So,
You're
kind
picking
of
one,
what is
yeah.
our responsibility, I guess, as kind of researchers and academics and activists as well. And, obviously as gendered people, or people who live in a gendered universe, and one that seems sort of undiagnosed, polarized, and persistently rebinarizing on top of that. So
Of course. I mean, there are some terrible things that you see, but which are sort of seem inexcusable. I mean, the BBC will platform people to talk about trans representation in sport, or to talk about surgery regret, or people that have detransitioned and changed their mind, but they will not actually have a trans person doing that. So they will have somebody who is not trans, doesn't identify as trans, who is then sort of commenting on that. And I think that's a kind of 101. Surely you'd have somebody who has gone through those things, or is a trans person, to speak about that. But then a lot of these debates are set up as very hostile. And like I said at the start, if it's set up as you have a group there saying your entire identity is a delusion bordering on a mental illness, you shouldn't have protection in law because you're asking people to collude with your mental illness, then you can understand why people wouldn't want to go on that show, and speak with those people, because they wouldn't want to give it the validity. But it's a problem because our media is set up in this way. It likes a battle, an adversarial battle between two people. That's how it wants to be. It basically likes to set everything up as if those people are still at the, Oxford Union, debating society, speaking from their little makeshift dispatch box. I hasten to add, I never went to a university like that, but I have been invited there to give talks, and was flabbergasted at what I saw with their little mini parliament kind of all set up. And I think that's how a lot of our media class have come from, those sort of backgrounds. They think it's just a game. It's a game, you win or lose a debate. And of course, in Parliament you take your votes, you say yay or you nay. It's a game, but of course it's not a game for the people that are on the receiving end of increasing levels of hate crime. The Guardian, the BBC itself, it needs to look at its own complicity in this. But the BBC last summer, did a report on rising hate crimes against LGBTQ people. So there's a responsibility there to not fan the flames, but I think they are very much fanning the flames.
I was going to say, I wish we could end again on a more hopeful note, but
change is happening. Yeah, there is a younger generation that doesn't want to be boxed in, doesn't like labels, are more likely to refer to themselves as not a label than any other label. Know people that use some of these 50 odd different terms and are quite comfortable with it. And change is a coming, whether people like it or not. So yeah, these categories that we have previously seen as fixed and unchanging are not seen in that way by younger people.